Delaware. I chair the Vision Coalition of Delaware, and I am the Chief Health Equity Officer and Chief Public Affairs Officer at Christiana Care. Really thrilled that you're joining us here today. We can advance the slide. I want to thank my fellow Vision Coalition leadership team members. We are a diverse group representing school districts, charter schools, teachers, higher ed, community leaders, community-based organizations, and school boards. I especially want to thank Secretary Mark Holodick for his partnership on this work and his leadership in education in our fine state of Delaware. Many of you were involved in the Student Success 2025 plan and recommendations, and I really want to thank you on behalf of all Delawareans for that participation and involvement. Delaware has made progress on about 60% of those recommendations in that plan. We have a lot to be proud of in the Student Success 2025 plan. Notably, Student Success 2025 recommends a student-centered funding system that is equitable and that supports student needs. We're excited about the initial steps the state has taken with opportunity funding, and we know we have a lot to do to achieve our vision for Delaware's education funding system. So really thrilled that you're joining us here today. Before I turn this over to our speakers, I wanted to share a finding from a recent survey of Delawareans conducted by the local Journalism Institute or Initiative. They found that most Delawareans believe that the state spends too little on the education system. That issue ranks higher than the other issues you see here: housing, law enforcement, economic growth, clean water. But you see that it is a top 5 issue when Delawareans rank their priorities, and among these priorities that Delawareans believe the state does not spend enough money on. Now we're going to hear what the research says about our spending on education in Delaware. Before we get specifically to that, though, I really want to thank all of you who joined us on March 17th at Wilmington U in Dover. It was a wonderful event. It was a great showing of about 140 teachers, students, educators, parents, just a tremendous diverse community, really showing up and engaging around the issue around equity and funding and really learning the basics. We heard from a number of local and national experts. And for those of you who weren't able to attend, or frankly, who just want a refresher, the recording and materials are on the Vision Coalition website, visioncoalitionde.org, if you'd like to refer to them, and I highly recommend it. We heard there on that day at the March 17th event from Drew Atkinson from the American Institute of Research, AIR. As many of you know, AIR will be issuing an assessment of the funding system later this year, something everyone is anticipating. And we believe it's very important to host this series to educate ourselves and all Delawareans about education funding, about this opportunity, so everyone is well informed in advance of receiving that AIR report. Drew did mention in his remarks on March 17th 3 principles they're looking at with respect to education funding: adequacy, equity, and wealth neutrality, and how important those 3 concepts are to guiding our future system. Today's talk will focus on the first 2, adequacy and equity, including progress in other states that have made changes and have made investments to prioritize, and what the importance of flexibility and setting priorities is. So we're really excited for the discussion we're going to have today. Now let's see briefly, we know who attended on March 17th, but let's see who's in the audience today, so we can really get a good sense of that. If you could briefly just check the box on the poll that's in front of you, whether you're a parent, educator, et cetera. So we have a great idea on who's in the audience. So take a second to fill out that poll, and then we'll proceed. Okay. We can. Okay, now let's see who's in the audience. We have a lot of community-based organizations, state and government officials. We have higher ed. We have educators, students and parents, the business community. So really terrific to see this engagement. Just thrilled you're joining us, and great to have such a diverse group. So really, really thrilled. Thank you so much for engaging. So as we proceed now on this segment, Why Money Matters, I'm excited to introduce our moderator, Dr. Shelley Rouser, the Education Department Chair from Delaware State University, and a wonderful member of the Vision Coalition leadership team. Shelley is going, is going to moderate a discussion with Dr. Julian LaFortune, Research Fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. Julian specializes in K-12 education finance and school capital funding policy. He's published research on the impacts of school finance reforms on student achievement in the American Economic Journal and Applied Economics. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of California, Berkeley. I'll now turn it over to Shelley and to guide her conversation with Julian. Thanks so much for joining us both today, Julian and Shelley.
Great. And thank you so much, Bettina. We have had some really great conversations as a leadership team. And one of our focus areas is making sure that when Delaware does change its funding system, we know it will have the impact that we intend for it to have. So we're very excited to be here today with Dr. Julian LaFortune to hear what the research does say, where money matters, and how Delaware can learn from the rest of the country. For the audience, before we delve right into the interview, to this discussion rather, please make sure that you put your questions in the Q&A function. We will definitely be sure to check that out regularly throughout the session and respond to them later in the webinar. So, Julian, a pleasure to talk with you. Let's delve right in.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for having me, and nice to be here, Shelley, and thank you, Bettina.
Great to have you. So to start, we've seen increases in school funding over the years. Why is this the case, and what do we get for all this money?
So this is one of the hotly debated issues, I think, around school funding research. We've seen spending go up for a variety, on a variety of things: lower class sizes, higher teacher salaries, more special education funding, capital, debt. It really isn't a one-size-fits-all picture. And I wanted to start off with just a few slides explaining, I think, some of this, putting Delaware in context with some nearby states, and then showing a little bit of what the research has shown and some of the research I've done, and a picture that we'll typically get on the school spending debate. So if you can advance the slide to the next one. So just a little bit on Delaware, and you're probably more familiar with this context than I am, but putting it in the context of other states. So Delaware, like most other states, like the national average, has seen a pretty, substantial increase over time. These are inflation-adjusted dollars, so going, in the late 80s, early 90s, from about $11,000, $12,000 in current spending, so excluding capital and other sources of kind of long-term spending, to almost, $17,000, $18,000 just before the pandemic. And this is lower, than some other nearby states like New Jersey or the District of Columbia, also New York, but also, higher than Virginia, and similar to some of your peers in Maryland and Pennsylvania. So a lot of this increase has really happened in the 90s and 2000s that people have talked about. And I think one thing to keep in mind too is that during this time, and you can advance to the next slide, a lot of states nationally were doing school finance reforms, like you may be contemplating now, where they're changing in their funding system in fundamental ways. going from lower to higher spending, but also lower spending to much higher spending in places that are lower income. And one thing that we saw when we've looked at this nationally, these school finance reforms, is that in the period of the 90s and early 2000s was one where the gap between high and low income districts, at least on average within states, closed over time. And so if you look, and this is just total revenues and districts in the Q1 that are the bottom, so the lowest income in a state, Q5, the highest income in a state, let's just look at their average spending. And you can see there was a pretty substantial 15, almost 20% gap in the 1990 that was essentially closed by the kind of end of the recession. It's exacerbated a little bit since then. But part of the reason we've seen one of, this big increase in spending is it's, greater in the lower income districts, which is in part a function of a lot of state efforts to try to increase spending in those areas that have the most disadvantaged students. And one way you can see this is if you advance to the next slide, when we split the gap now, so this is the Y, the kind of vertical axis here is just the gap between total spending in the highest or lowest income. So that a negative number means you spend more in high income districts than you do in low income districts. You see that the state, basically all of the action there is coming from these states that had finance reform. So in a lot of the states that didn't change their system, they're still spending more, have more total revenues in the districts that are lowest income, whereas those that are the highest income, or those that are, the states that have reforms are really where we've seen this kind of more progressive spending take hold. And then the final thing I want to show on the next slide is that it's often said that we haven't gotten anything for it. So we have the spending increase. It's largely driven, or more so driven by spending increases in the lowest income places, especially in these states that had reforms. And what we've seen, often the national picture will be painted as, well, we haven't seen test score progress. And while that's true for reading, what I'm showing here is math. And if we just look at 4th and 8th grade, 12th grade is a bit of a messy picture because there's changes in graduation and dropout rates over this time. So researchers tend to like to look at 4th and 8th grade because that's a more consistent kind of set of students. You can see that actually up through the 90s and 2000s, when we saw these big spending increases, there were also increases in test scores. They've lagged kind of in the latter half of the 2010s, and here it's showing 2022, which is a significant fall. So there are a lot of challenges, but I think even if we look at the broad stroke picture, before getting into studies that try to do a more careful job, we've seen increased spending in a lot of low-income places. And when we look nationally, especially on math, less so on reading, we have seen some progress there.
Great. Can I take us to our next question?
Absolutely, yeah.
All right. So can you give us a sense of the body of the research? Tell us more about the time period of this research, the range of organizations that have been involved.
So it's, the research base has really increased in the last decade and a half, in part because there are much better data sources. There's better study design and better methods. And a lot of the research is really focused on this kind of 80s, 90s, 2000s period where there were significant reforms. And the reason is that these big changes in states allow for better studies within states, better studies across states, because you have so many changes to the finance system. Some of this was legislatively driven. Some of it was court mandated. In school finance reform litigation cases, where often a state's Supreme Court will mandate some sort of changes. And so broadly, the research is involved academics from kind of across the different institutions, public and private, a lot of think tanks, so a broad set of kind of researchers at different levels, as well as those in government or in state Department of Educations. And you can advance to the next slide, and one way of framing this research is to look, and I'll pull here, and just before showing this graph, because it's a little bit of a complicated one, I'll pull from one of the recent meta-analyses that looks at dozens of studies that have been done recently, and try to figure out, well, what is the average impact of spending more? If we spend $1 more, what do we get for that? And here, this basically, you can kind of envision each study as fitting somewhere in a quadrant, in four parts basically of a graph. One is, the top right is where we increase spending, and do we see increased educational attainment, increased outcomes? The bottom left would be, if we decrease spending, do we see decreases? And then the top left and bottom right are kind of, where we would expect something might be weird about the study. We see lower spending, but higher attainment, or maybe higher spending, but negative attainment. And so you can advance to the next slide. And what we see is that, and each dot here is a different study. And then that kind of solid line in the middle is the kind of line, taking the average across all of these studies. You can see that, it basically fits this picture where the more we go kind of up to the right, the more we're spending, the higher the impact we get as well. So it's really, and there's one study on the bottom left that's actually looking at spending cuts during the Great Recession, but we have a lot more evidence about spending increases. And so broadly, you can see here that everything is in the top right. Everything where we've increased spending, studies tend to find positive effects almost universally. And this is in terms of educational attainment. So think kind of graduation, years of schooling, college attendance. There's kind of different studies study different things, and the authors in this meta-analysis took care to try to standardize that. And then the last thing that I'll say is, and we can go to the next slide here, just on the research. There have been kind of two, competing camps of interpreting the research in different ways and kind of debating this money matters question. But in the most recent meta-analyses, so the most recent kind of compilation of studies, studying the studies on this question, there's two. There's the Jackson and Makavicius, and then there's the Handel and Eric Hanishek, and Dr. Hanishek has been one who's been more critical of broad spending increases over time. But even his meta-analysis shows that overall, it's broadly true that studies are finding positive impacts on test scores and educational attainment. And the majority are even finding positive and what we like to say is statistically significant, so that they're large enough and the studies are precise enough to say that we're actually detecting something that's real and it's not just positive by chance. And so I'll end the slides there so we can get more to the conversation. But the point is that there's really a lot of research that's come out. A lot of it is around state level reforms. And it tends to pretty uniformly suggest that there's positive impacts. Now, that doesn't mean it's the same in all cases. But when we spend more, and perhaps that goes to intuition, on average in these different contexts across states, across time, across different types of districts, we're getting kind of improved outcomes that range from test scores to attainment to even a few studies that are able to track students and their families years later to look at poverty and earnings and long run outcomes that we may care about even more than just test scores.
Thank you, Julian. And before we go on, you're an economist. How convincing is this research?
So I think the research is very convincing, and we've gotten to a point where it's much more convincing in the past. In the past, a lot of studies were what we call observational. And what that means is that we're really just looking at two things next to each other, trying to control them, right? So we see spending go up in a district or in a state. Do we see achievement go up? Do we see graduation go up? But that ignores a lot of confounding factors, right? Because a lot of times when we increase spending, it's compensatory. We're trying to direct funding towards a place. And so if we were to look at just that kind of raw relationship, we might get messed up. And so a lot of studies have really tried to more carefully disentangle and use, changes that are court ordered and the kind of discrete nature of the court order, or use things like local bond or ballot elections to increase spending in a district, and then look at very, very close elections that pass or fail just by, fractions of a percent of votes, and then compare those districts that have different spending, and try to use situations that are what are referred to often as natural experiment settings, where we can't experimentally give one district more money than another, but we can find settings that, look like that and are a little bit better in terms of the ability to control for the other things that are happening in the world that we know affect the economics of spending as well as the outcomes of students.
Thanks. That's really helpful. So in terms of outcomes, we tend to think in terms of student achievement on tests, but what are some other longer term impacts that are demonstrated in communities that make these investments? We're talking income, property values, and the like. Can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, so I can talk about a couple of these things, and we have research from a few studies looking at longer term impacts beyond just schooling on income, and I guess income and poverty and household composition, and what these find looking at kids that had higher spending in their youth and then following them into adulthood in their 20s and 30s and now sometimes even in their 40s, is that they have better life outcomes when they're exposed to these significantly higher levels of spending. And this kind of comes from these state level reforms, the earlier ones that happened in the 70s, 80s, early 90s, because it takes a while for these kids to get to that point. So that's one strain of research. I think that's something that there's a lot of interest in studying further to kind of untangle that. There's a recent study, and this is kind of an emerging area, looking not just at income as well, but also crime, and finding decreases in crime rate. This was in Michigan, for places that had big increases in spending, which if you're keeping kids in school longer, kids are going to, finishing high school or more likely to go to college. It stands to reason, and this is what, is being found in the research, but it stands to reason that this may have an impact on, involvement in the criminal justice system, which, as we know, is something that kind of happens disproportionately in the young ages. And so efforts to try to kind of instill schools with more resources can be beneficial in that way. And then the second strain isn't on the individual side as much, but there's research looking at the communities, and in economics, often looking at house prices as kind of an index for how much does the community value these investments. And there's a lot of research showing that, both when kind of increased spending is passed, or there's higher, teacher spending or operational spending, but also when there's new buildings and capital spending, it finds, on average at least, that households are valuing this additional spending. We see prices go up in these areas, which is a signal that, individuals, when they're making decisions on where to live, are willing to kind of pay more to have better schools in terms of their infrastructure, but also better schools in terms of the inputs that are provided to them.
So along these lines, tell us, what does an equitable funding system look like? That's what we're here for. Specifically, can you tell us a bit about also needs-based funding?
So I think and folks have different kind of precise definitions of equity. But broadly speaking, I think the most equitable system is one that's able to provide, differentiated resources and sufficient resources to students that have greater needs. I think, it's not something it's something researchers, but also practitioners, community members would probably agree with some statement to the effect of, some students require more resources, or we can, students that have greater disadvantages, we ought to provide them with the, resources they need to succeed, and that may be greater in some cases. And so the kind of principles of an equitable system are often, framed in that way. We want to kind of both get rid of the underlying differences in just that come from local property wealth, because that's one determinant of funding. But beyond that, we don't necessarily just want to equalize, right, by having the state come in and try to, equalize out the differences that may emerge from local spending. We want to even go beyond that, because we acknowledge, and this is backed up by the research, that there are, big impacts, especially for these lower income, these socioeconomically disadvantaged students, of providing them with additional funding. And that's really where a lot of the research is from, and what the research tends to find. And so I think a lot of, the principle that a state should have when we're looking at this type of funding system is really about, can we provide additional funding for those students whose needs are greater?
And along the lines, while we're here talking about the equitable funding systems, what that looks like, can you also talk about how funds are allocated across school districts? Can you talk about that in the context of an equitable funding system, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we look at how funds are allocated across different districts, it's often, a function of both state and local dollars. So districts are able to raise dollars locally. The state has a funding system that determines how much districts get. And that's kind of and that's what we are most concerned about, right? What are districts getting? How does that match up with the characteristics of their student body, their demographics, their levels of relative advantage or disadvantage, and the relative levels of local wealth? And so that's something that, if we just left communities up to kind of resource the schools based on their local wealth, we'd have really large inequities. And so that's where we're trying to, come in as states, as even, federally, to try to remedy those differences and those extremes that exist in our society. One other point I'll make beyond that, though, is there's not just funding across districts. We also care about how funding is allocated across schools within the district. And this is something that is often less control, I'd say, isn't something that states often control as directly. But it can be hugely important too, because we know that districts can sometimes be segregated. There can be, schools that are more advantaged than others, schools that are higher performing than others. And so it matters how those resources that are provided from the state to the district then feed, and flow from district to school to students, right? If we give additional funding that's intended for high need students in some manner, is that funding reaching those high need students in the school sites that generate them, in the classrooms that generate them? Those are kind of key questions, and the evidence is, is kind of mixed depending on the type of funding system that's in play.
Very interesting. Thank you. So how should funds be used to serve students? Which investments tend to show the greatest return?
So when we look at the kind of like return on investment evidence, and we just kind of take the, a step back from even just school spending, but look broadly at interventions, what the best evidence tells us is that the earlier you invest in a child, the greater the return. But it doesn't mean the return is still high kind of all through childhood. So early childhood investments are, in the research when we look at kind of later life outcomes, have very robust kind of positive effects that pay for themselves, many times over when we count the earnings, when we count reduced criminality, when we count the fact that the, high earnings means you'll also pay higher taxes in the future. And so there's a lot of these benefits come from kind of early childhood or early elementary interventions. But when we look at educational spending, it's true that we see big returns kind of across the age spectrum too. And, kids, I think investments in kids just tend to be ones across different, settings that produce a lot of kind of positive returns and positive return on the investment. When we look at then specific classroom policies, I think is where the research, can point us in the right direction, but is sometimes more mixed. And so there's this kind of strong, I'd say like a big picture evidence on class size. When we look at, studies of class size that really try to carefully control for just the class size impact, we see that, smaller class size leads to better educational outcomes in a variety of measures. Same goes for having better teachers. But the subtlety kind of comes with, okay, well, what happens when we implement these policies at scale? And so some states have tried class size reduction policies. California, where I'm from, had one. Florida, others have tried it. And there the evidence has been more mixed. And so this is just one kind of point of caution from the literature. One thing that didn't really happen when these class size reductions went in play at scale is an increase in the teaching labor force, or the supply of teachers. And as we know, a lot of districts are already facing shortages, especially in kind of critical subject areas. And so if you go and kind of increase or to reduce class sizes to try to spend, funding in that way and mandate that districts do this, even if lower class sizes are better, it still takes some time to phase in. You have to find new teachers. Then there may not be a ready and waiting, supply of educators just ready to kind of take that, take on those positions. And that's certainly something that happened in California. So the implementation didn't kind of go, as suggested. Similar things can be said about teacher, broader efforts to improve teacher quality, which have been, incredibly, somewhat controversial in some states and have varied, from all sorts of policies that are more kind of heavy-handed and accountability to others that are about financial incentives. So implementation, I think, is something where the research is, maybe suggests some caution or some care in how these are implemented. But by and large, when we look at it, most of what a school is spending on are our staff, right? And that's kind of the biggest expenditure. And the kind of best studies of class size, the best studies of just, having higher teacher quality show that has big impacts on students. And so how we get there is a function of the funding policy, but the research at least a high level is clear that if implemented correctly, these can lead to big gains.
Thanks. Let's get one more question in before we see what questions the audience has for us. Tell us about some advantages of having more flexible funding at the local level, and what does the research say about such flexibility?
So the research is still, I'd say, on flexibility is still somewhat emerging. And that's it in part because I think people are trying to get a better understanding of these state level changes that have happened. But broadly speaking, why I think there's both a research case and then there's kind of an intuitive case for why we want more flexible funding. And just intuitively, different districts have different student bodies, have different local contexts, have different, contexts of buildings, labor forces, the labor market that they're in. And so we want districts to be able to respond to those differences. If we kind of from the state level come down with a one size fits all formula, that one size fits all may not work well for any particular district, or it may work well for some, but not for others. And so by kind of imposing, costs and imposing funding structures that are built around some assumption of here's the right level, it kind of, it basically diminishes the amount of flexibility that locals have to adjust to different circumstances, be it in terms of the teachers that they can find in their labor market or the needs of their students, right? Do they have students that have more, social and emotional needs? They have students that have more socioeconomic disadvantage that may require other types of counseling resources that go beyond those in a more affluent district. These are going to vary. And so that's kind of why researchers often suggest the best, approach is to fund student need in kind of a weighted formula. So we're giving more dollars towards those districts that have greater, student need, that have more kind of low income or disadvantaged student populations. But we're also still allowing them the flexibility to deploy those funds in the way that kind of best fits their local context. And we have a little bit of one, I'll just point to one piece of evidence, and this is from Washington State, and this is kind of a retort, I guess, to sometimes what we hear is, well, if the funding is restricted or based on certain, resource categories, and that's what goes to districts, but they still have some flexibility to spend, then what does it matter if we have, say, a student weighted formula or one that's more resource based? And Washington is one of a handful of states, along with Delaware and a few others, that has a mostly resource based formula. And even there, even in Washington, you can still fund your districts have some flexibility in how they spend. But one thing when you compare Washington to other nearby states that have more flexible funding formulas is there's just a heck of a lot less variation in what they do, how they staff, their class sizes, their teacher salaries, their use of other support services, pupil supports, counselors, other kind of mental health practitioners in schools. That just tends to vary a lot more in states that don't have resource-based formulas. And that's in part because these formulas somewhat constrict districts. But even in a state like Washington that has some flexibility, often districts then just spend in line with what the formula says. They allocate funding across schools within their district in line with what the formula says. And so even implicitly, these formulas can sometimes kind of have that, what we might think of as a perhaps perverse effect of really allocating funding in this one size fits all way, when that may not be really the best way of spending in a particular school or district.
All right, thank you. Learned so much already. I think this is a good place for us to pause, see what questions the audience might have for us. Bettina, do we have any questions bubbling up in the Q&A?
Yes, we do, actually. And let me see if I can, well, I can't go on video, but I can address the ones in the Q&A. So we have from Maria Rodriguez, are there particular characteristics of the funding mechanisms that were studied that were most promising or yielded the greatest gains? Do you want to speak to that, Dr. or Julian?
I'm happy to speak to that. I think one is, what the research is most clear. So I guess I'll talk about two aspects, but one, and this is about, this can happen across different funding mechanisms, but where the research is most clear is that spending more on lower income students, kind of more socioeconomically disadvantaged students, yields greater return. So if we just look at dollar for dollar return on investment, it's much higher than it is, if we look at like a spending increase in a, say, wealthier, more affluent district. And there, I think, is some of the disconnect on, these money matters debates, because we've been predominantly increasing more in lower income places, but we've also been spending more in higher income places. And there we just don't see the same return. And so I think, one kind of aspect of a funding formula that can produce both a greater, return on investment in terms of like an efficiency or efficacy standpoint, but then also be more equitable, is to really weight student need higher and to try to direct funds to those places that their students have the greatest needs, and that allows districts to then kind of attend to those needs in better ways, or just more, allow them to do more, be it through lower class sizes or additional support services, or better retention of teachers by attracting them through higher salaries or other types of means. Another that I'll point to, and this is where I think flexibility, just getting back to this flexibility point about why it's important, is a lot of state level funding mechanisms that tend to direct funds in one single way, be it, towards teachers or class size reduction or an increase in teacher salary, run into kind of, implementation issues at scale. And particularly on the staffing side, if say we want to lower class sizes, I gave the example of California, but in general, there are labor markets for staff, there are constrained resources, the education sector and districts are competing for staffing and other resources with other, with the broader labor market. And what that means is that if we direct funding in kind of these very prescribed ways, or huge increases in one prescribed way, it can really crowd out these, the kind of the efficacy of any gain, because we're not really taking into account the kind of preparation aspect of it. We're not providing for that increase in the supply of, say, new educators, but we're also requiring districts to still kind of forge ahead and do a policy that may not make sense in their local context. And so if they can't, if a district gets money to lower class sizes, but can't find enough educators, they don't have the ability to then pivot to, say, use that funding for some other means, perhaps, increased instructional time with, other types of educational staff, or increased, better facilities, or something else about the instructional materials, or tutoring programs, technology, right? There are all these different needs. And so I think the research that tends to be the most promising are really where funds are directed to the low income, high need students. And then within that, they're allowed to be more flexible, because different districts are at different starting points, have different needs, and then they have their local economic context that they have to contend with as well when it comes to staff.
Yeah, and you talked about that, like the need for that, the weighted formula based on student need and that flexibility, because like a school in one part of the state may have maybe a micro labor market, or student economics, or community issues that are impacting what they can do with those funds. So that flexibility, as you underscored, is really important and better than a one size fits all. So another question that we have is from Malik Stewart: what role does the federal government have to play in funding, given the reduction of funding over the years? And if you could speak to both the reduction of funding, which is the premise there, and the role the federal government has to play in funding.
So the federal role is smaller in education. I think the reduction part maybe doesn't quite fit in with the current one-time funds that we have now. So, temporarily, there's a lot of stimulus dollars that are still flowing through schools. So, in this year, next year, last year, it's not exactly a reduction of federal funds, but those funds will go away too. And so the federal role has been bigger with the injection of these stimulus funds. But when you look kind of outside the pandemic period and the next few years that districts, or couple of years that districts have to spend it, what we see is a role that's, depending on the state and district, you're looking at 5 to 10% of funding, maybe a little bit more in districts that get more Title I funding. So it's not a huge role. Broadly, I think it's hard to envision the federal government taking a leap forward, or really those in Washington agreeing on spending a heck of a lot more for school funding. It'd be one way that you could really provide additional funding for low income students and use a tax base that maybe is a little bit more equitable, or doesn't help kind of or doesn't require that locals pay as much in property taxes, right, if it all came from the federal government. But we're just not there in that system. And so I think the federal government, especially when it comes to kind of different, equalizing out levels across states that have different levels of wealth, the federal government could play a role there. But it's just a lot of the action when it comes to school finance is at the state level, because state and local funding is 90% of funding. The federal government, beyond some specific programs for, meals and Title I for low income students, additional funding there, and then also some funding for special education, just hasn't really historically indicated that they're going to play a major role in school funding. And I think given our partisan climate, it's hard to envision that, changing anytime soon.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. And from another question from Susan Mitchell: looking at processes for determining local portions of funding, are there some that seem to work better than others? Delaware uses a referendum process that doesn't seem to be working. So could you speak to how we get local funding, or different ways that local funding is obtained, perhaps, vis-a-vis our approach with a referendum?
Yeah, so I'll admit, I'll just speak more generally, because I don't know the kind of all of the ins and outs of Delaware system, and sometimes the context can matter a lot when it comes to these local funding. But broadly speaking, I think a state funding formula, when you think of what the target amount for students is, needs to take into account local shares and what districts are able to raise locally. And so some of these kind of have, and this is the way California works and others work similarly, kind of you have a local amount that you raise, and anything that you raise that, so if you raise an amount locally based on your property taxes, there's a target amount per student based on the formula that a district gets, and anything that you don't raise locally, the state provides and tops off. So if you're in a low wealth district that can't raise a lot of funding, the state will step in with a lot. If you're in a high wealth district that raises all your own funding, you don't really get a lot of additional support from the state. Where the nuance comes in is that you also don't want then these kind of areas that have higher local contributions to then cut their taxes, because then you have less money in the system. And so some states will have basically kind of mechanics in the formula that try to ensure effort. So maybe they don't, completely, they allow for some local funding to stick, but they want everywhere to kind of provide equal effort into funding their schools. And then the state tops off beyond that. So effort in terms of how, what share of your property tax base are you funding? Again, and that depends on the ability of locals to change taxes. That depends on also, how property taxes are assessed, because there can be a big gap between actual property wealth and assessments. That's certainly true in some states. So I think the big kind of principle that tends to work best is some acknowledgement, and it's not necessarily going to be the same in every state because every state kind of has unique dynamics there across districts. But some acknowledgement that local funding needs to be taken into account in the state formula. Those that can't raise as much locally, if we're thinking about an equitable school system, should be able to get more from the state level if it's ultimately about providing kind of these, equitable resources at the student level. But I think care needs to be taken to ensure that if you do have a funding system that tries to equalize in that way, and take into account local funding, you don't create incentives or the ability as much for, say, locals in high wealth areas that are already paying a lot into the system to then cut their taxes. Because what we don't want is a system where the state has to then step in even further and you've kind of gutted some of these more stable property tax revenues that people were previously paying in.
Yes, certainly complex, thinking about those unintended consequences. So thanks for focusing on that, and great question, Susan. We have another question. Are there any states that mirror Delaware's current funding system? What have they done to improve their system? So thinking about states that look like Delaware and our funding to date. Has your research revealed that?
So I haven't done as much. A lot of my research has been more kind of broadly nationally focused, looking at kind of the spending impacts on students. But I do know in Tennessee, I guess this is the most prominent example for me. So Tennessee had a funding system that I think my understanding at least is it was not too dissimilar from Delaware's, mostly resource-based. Delaware, Tennessee had this along with a handful of other states where it's kind of dollars for specific resources is where most of the funding in the formula comes from. But Tennessee had a big reform that's just now being implemented that shifted to a student-centered funding formula. So it's kind of dollars per student with additional weights for low-income students, for English language learners, for students with special education needs. And that funding system is a pretty substantial shift from where they were before. And that, is just now taking into effect and being implemented. And my understanding is a lot of work was kind of done, over years to kind of foster the right conditions and, garner the support. But that's one that I would look to, I guess, as an example to see a different political climate, of course, but just to see an example of a state that had, a system very, until very recently that looked perhaps like Delaware's and then was able to accomplish a pretty substantial shift that's more in line with what the research finds on at least best practices when it comes to state level funding formulas.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks for pointing out Tennessee, and I expect should continue to track how that goes and the impact of that. It was really interesting to hear from you around some of the research, how we've seen the positive educational achievement and test scores when we had some increased spending up in that top right quadrant. So that was quite interesting to see. I think it's also really interesting just to hear about, and I think we all kind of know this intuitively, but that there is a return. The earlier you invest in a child, the greater the return, and that they pay for themselves and improved earnings, less engagement with criminal justice, higher educational achievement, better quality of life. I mean, that's just really terrific. But that not only in early childhood and in elementary school, but throughout the education continuum, that those investments really pay for themselves and really improve the vitality of our community and the educational attainment of our students and actually generational wealth building. So that's really terrific to hear. So Shelley, how about if I turn it back to you and you can continue with some more questions and ask everybody to keep putting your questions in the Q&A. That would be terrific and really great engagement. So thank you.
Yeah,
Shelley?
great questions have come up. So thanks, Bettina. Let's delve back into some other questions. Delaware is often ranked in the top 15 spending states. Help us understand why we might be spending on the high end, but not achieving those better outcomes.
So my understanding is Delaware's in top 10 to 15. I think, one thing to keep in mind too is it's not always exactly apples to apples across states. So there is a bit where, some states kind of put in pension funding and other things, and some states can look like they're spending more, but the resources that are actually provided in the classroom maybe aren't as different. So that's one thing I think to always be cautious with cross-state comparisons. But then the more important point is that context differs across states too. And so if you're comparing a high spending state, but a state that also has a relatively more, disadvantaged population than other states, then you may not want to just kind of compare the average test scores of those states. And so the Urban Institute does, or at least before the pandemic, they kind of did a comparison where they essentially re-ranked states on their NAEP scores, their national test scores, that kind of took into account differences in the student body. So trying to make it, more similar across states. And that's one where I think Delaware looks, and I was just looking at this before, a little bit better across most metrics. And so the ranking on national tests is lower, but when you actually take into account differing student characteristics, it's not as different. It's in the kind of upper half on most subjects and grades. So that's kind of one part of the disconnect. But another is also how the funds are deployed, right? Is it deployed in a way where it gives districts the ability to respond to local conditions? Does it then, give districts flexibility to spend in the schools that have the greater needs that are struggling? Because that's a big part of it. If a district has a school that's struggling and, maybe has low test scores or kind of, poor outcomes in some other metric, and they want to invest more there, does the funding system actually allow for them to do that? To kind of provide lower class sizes or higher paid teachers or additional instructional resources. And so that's one, part I think about the efficiency of spending. We can spend a high level, but if we kind of think, and this is what's supported by the research, that funding for low-income students matters more, and maybe funding for the highest income students, they're probably going to do, and they tend to do relatively well, in districts of different funding levels, then we really want to look at how the funding is distributed, and that average can sometimes be misleading.
Thanks, Julian. We know that ongoing sustained funding is what's really needed here, but what do we know about the one-time relief funds that have been injected into our education system in the last few years? Can you talk to that a bit?
Yeah, so this is really the multi-billion-dollar question that I think is bigger to focus among my own team here, as well as kind of researchers across states and nationally, looking at, well, where is this spending going? What is it? How is it actually impacting the student experience, and how is that going to pay off, and what can we learn from that, right? Because it's one time in nature. So it's still, there's a lot of funds still left to be spent, because districts still have a little over a year to spend kind of the last pot of federal dollars. But at least in the initial looks that we've done at, the initial work we've done, both in California, and this kind of mirrors what others have found in other states, and also looking at it nationally, is that a lot of the spending, the one-time funds early on went into things like technology and health and safety, just to get schools open or to kind of open them safely, and then provide students with the means for distance learning or remote learning. And so That's a big one-time effort. I think the more recent funding is going towards addressing what we know, some of the, losses or the kind of reductions in achievement trends that we've seen, right? These test score declines that we've seen and trying to address those academic needs, but also social and emotional needs, because attendance has gone down. I don't know the context for Delaware here, but in a lot of states, attendance is down and there's a lot of kind of student mental health concerns. And so this is where a lot of the funding is going. Of course, this funding is one time in nature. It's going to go away in a year and a little over a year. So districts will have to reduce some of these efforts that they're spending on, which is useful for a recovery purpose, right? We provide one-time spending. We're trying to kind of swiftly get out of this learning loss hole that we're in. But it also means that districts will face difficult choices. And to the extent that some of these programs are working and there are still kind of reductions from the pandemic in learning or ground to make up from the pandemic losses, then, that will have to come from somewhere, or districts will have to cut some of these extra services that they've been providing. And so the hope is that at least we'll have learned, districts will have learned things that worked well, gained some experience with that, with this additional funding. And then they, perhaps, and this will vary state to state and locality to locality, depending on how much those investments then want to come back from the state or local government to kind of offset those federal reductions. But I think the hope is that those programs that at least seem to be working don't just go away, but that'll require new resources. And that because there won't be federal money left in that kind of pot, in after the end of 2024.
Thank you. And we can pull up the opportunity funding slide. That would be great. Thank you. So Delaware recently adopted opportunity funding, which provides about $600 per low-income and multilingual learner student, about an additional 3% per student. The slide lists some of the ways these funds have been spent, which mirror the high return investments you're speaking of. What advice would you give Delaware? Are we on the right track?
Yeah, I would say this is, spending more on, again, and just to kind of reiterate what I said earlier, the research is pretty clear about spending, and even more clear and consistent when it comes to spending on low-income students, as well as, English learner and other kind of multilingual and students that are often designated as high need, requiring additional resources. And so this is something that I think is very promising. I think when, on this slide, just looking at the kind of 3% per student, a lot of states have higher weights than that. That's not a huge increase, right? 616 per student definitely gets you something. But if you do want to kind of be, I guess I'll just say more, more serious or more intentional to really put some kind of fiscal weight behind, providing a more equitable education context, then it really is kind of imperative to do, to kind of weight that a little bit more, weight that significantly more. So California, just an example, has a 20% weight at base for low-income students, and then there's an additional concentration grant in districts that have concentrated poverty. And so that's just an example of a potential magnitude. Other states have something similar in that range, 10 to 20% as well. And I think there's a lot of researchers and policymakers and other folks that would argue that that's not even necessarily enough. I mean, we have pretty large and systemic gaps in achievement and outcomes, in students of different socioeconomic backgrounds, students of different racial backgrounds and contexts. And so I think it's, we want to be serious about kind of deploying funding in ways that addresses that, then I think it has to be weighted in a way that, is more than just kind of marginal, I guess. But just to the, second part of the question on the investments, I think these are all, these are all useful kind of things, and giving districts the ability to kind of deploy what they think is needed in their specific context, I think is something where, not only is the money going to make a difference, but it's going to be spent more efficiently, because you're not kind of incentivizing or even forcing districts to spend it in ways that may not make sense given their context.
Thank you. A pleasure talking with you. And we'll pause here. And Bettina, we have some time for some other questions. Are there other questions that have come up in the chat or the Q&A?
Well, thanks so much, Shelley, and thanks so much, Julian, for your great comments and the additional content that you've shared. We're not seeing other questions yet in the Q&A. I know we had a lot earlier. It was really very interesting to hear from you, Julian, though, with respect to the opportunity funding and noting that, you know, moving intentionally beyond kind of marginal investments to investments that will have more fiscal weight to address really large and systemic gaps across different student bodies is really important for us to hear and for us to think about as we look to learn. We are, this is we are part of an education coalition. We have many educators on the line joining us today. And we are at Christiana Care, where I work. We say we're a learning institution. It's our obligation, frankly, to learn more about funding and education, and from other states. It's been fabulous to get all your expertise. Do you have any final words of advice or insights that you'd like to share with respect to our education funding and the work that we're doing, and in advance of the AIR report coming out toward the end of the year, Julian?
Yeah, the only one I'll point to that I kind of mentioned but didn't get into as much, and it's been a topic of, I think, more emerging topic in the research looking at funding formulas, is that especially when districts are more segregated or they have more or less affluent sides of town, of schools, it's incredibly important to at least build in some mechanism to understand how funds are being spent across schools in the same district, because that's one of the big sources of differences in student experience as well. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. Are we, if you do say have a formula, these opportunity funding dollars that flow to districts, are those spent on the high, are they spent on the low income and multilingual students that it's intended for? And then beyond that, if you were to say weight that more, provide other mechanisms, I think that's kind of an area of both, policy interest, but also kind of equity interest as well. And that's something I'll say, I gave a couple positive examples of California earlier, but that's something where California hasn't really built in, an accountability or even a transparency mechanism there. And so there are a lot of concerns. We provide this additional funding to low-income districts, to districts with concentrated poverty. But some of them do a very good job at targeting that to the school sites with the needy students and then to the students themselves, whereas others don't, or at least don't do a good job of reporting how they do that. And given that we have, big gaps both across, but also within districts, I think it's kind of, something that's imperative to the design to keep in mind that there is, we do want to make sure that ultimately the students who have the greatest needs are the ones that are getting the additional resources.
Yeah, and you mentioned that earlier, not only, that we get additional funding for are allocated to certain districts, but within those districts to the specific schools to really get those funds to the students with the greatest needs, with the greatest gaps, to make sure that we're getting the funds where we intend them to go and where they can have the most impact. So a really great final point there from you. I'd like to check and see if we have any final questions. Let me go back to the Q&A. Here from Malik Stewart, we do have one additional question. Can you speak to the transparency regarding funding allocation across the districts and the state of usability for the common person to digest? Are there any ideal formats that you have encountered? So transparency around allocation of funds across the district and how usable that is for people to digest as we get to transparency. Are there formats that are you familiar with that area?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'm trying to think of ideal formats. I can speak more to ones that are much less than ideal. I think it's just, and this is where different, and this is something, I guess, I'll go back. I know it's not super useful for the Delaware context, but the California context here that's still being debated. How do we actually require that districts not just post their accounting of funding, but they do it in ways that's actually accessible to people beyond, useful to not just researchers, but say local stakeholders and advocates and parents. And one thing that we do here in California that I'll say is not ideal and not particularly useful is that we have districts basically fill out this very long document describing all of their plans about how they're going to spend money and spend these funds that I talked about for these high need, low income student populations. But often these end up as, documents that are 50, 100, 200. I think Los Angeles had a 300-page document that's just not accessible for parents. It's not accessible for researchers because it's not standardized. And so that's kind of a worst of both worlds. And so I think something to keep in mind when you kind of have, any sort of change or try to build more transparency in the system is really to make it, both consistent so that it's usable for people to compare across districts if you want to really understand what's going on at a statewide level, but that it's also easy to break into apart into what are the key elements so that, a local stakeholder, a parent can look pretty clearly and see, well, this is the number that's comparable to other districts, but I'm just getting, some broad number and I don't need all of the details. I don't need a 100-page PDF kind of documenting that because that's just not approachable. That doesn't help me make the decisions that I need to as a parent or really to understand my school in the way that, we would hope local accountability or trying to kind of encourage that process of local accountability, would kind of make happen.
That was certainly a great question, and thinking about the value, frankly, of transparency in the space is super important. We have another question: how do states that have addressed finance revisions ensure that charter schools are addressed in the funding process so all children being served are receiving the funding needed to support their individual needs? That came from Linda Zankowski.
So this is a good question, and I think it just varies a lot by states, and you can kind of imagine it varies a lot by state based on how the state's political attitude is towards charter schools. And so charter schools have more or less political support, more or less political power in different states. And so the ways that it's addressed, it can vary a lot. Sometimes it's just built into the formula. A charter kind of counts as a district or an LEA, a local education agency, so they're getting funding the same way through the formula. That's often how it will work. But in some cases, those base levels can be either different or they, depend, say, not on the charter student body, but on the population of the local district. So that's how it works in California. The charter, for the purposes of the formula, how many high need students does the charter have? That depends on the kind of home district that the charter is in, which means that some that have serve very high student need populations, but are in districts that are perhaps more modest or middle income, don't get the same level of funding that they would get, say, if they were part of a district. And so that can be a concern as well when it comes to the charter sector, because those are public school students as well. So you want to make sure that those students are getting the resources that are kind of that they generate, right, that they kind of deserve given the allocation mechanism.
So important to look at district and charter schools as we're considering the impact of equity and funding. So you've talked some about spending more. I know I made a note, spending more in the lowest income areas and students with the high socioeconomic needs yields the greatest return, greater the ROI, and leads to greater equity in educational attainment and resources. Really important to keep that in mind. We've heard about the efficiency of funding, the impact of funding on that return and on student attainment, the importance of flexibility. You talked a lot about that, not having a one size fits all. And then we just heard about transparency for parents, transparency for the public, transparency for researchers, so that we actually know what's happening with the funds. Your insights and comments have been really terrific. And I know I've learned a lot. I hope the others on the call have learned a lot. I'm really grateful that you joined us today. As far as wrapping up now, anything else, Shelley, from you? You've done a fabulous job, as always, facilitating this discussion. Anything you'd like to share?
No, thank you. It was a pleasure speaking with you, Jillian. Thanks so much for being a part of these discussions. Really valuable. But
Yeah,
thank
absolutely.
you, Tina. Always
Thanks
a
so
pleasure
much for
working with
having
you,
me.
Tina. Sorry, Jillian.
Oh, I was just going to say thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to come speak with you all today.
Wonderful. And so thank you both, Shelley and Julian, for this engaging discussion. The Vision Coalition will post this recording and the materials from this webinar on our website, visioncoalitionde.org, and we'll share via email. So sign up for our mailing list if you haven't already done so. And thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. Let's keep on learning. We'll continued learning and make sure that we can do the best and really work to advance education equity for all students in Delaware. Thanks so much for joining, and have a safe and wonderful day. Take care. Bye-bye.